Before we start, let's talk a bit about me. So I'm currently doing an internship where I work on Secure Codebox, which is an open source project, cloud security scanner. And I study computer science at TU Darmstadt, where I also did my thesis at CIMO, and this talk is about my thesis. So let's start with a quick introduction into internet protocols, like in an abstract way. So what happens when you're visiting a website with your browser and, for example, in the Apple Cosmos with Safari? So first, your browser or operating system performs a DNS request to a DNS resolver with the particular host name. So in that case, CIMO.de. And the DNS resolver responds with the corresponding IP address. Then the browser establishes a connection to that IP address, so to the web server, and then performs an HTTP request to the web server, to which the web server just responds with the web page's contents. However, there are privacy problems in both of these steps. So first, regarding DNS, you expose your IP address to the DNS resolver together with the content of the DNS query. So the host name you are requesting. So the DNS resolver can simply create a browsing history consisting of your IP address as an identifier for you, together with these host names as the websites you visited. So he knows like exactly which websites you visited. And in the second step, the web browser, to which you also connect to and indirectly expose your IP address, which is then often used by, for example, advertisement companies as a unique identifier again for you. There are some current approaches to counter these privacy problems. However, most of them require some sort of trust. For example, we have the DNS resolver of Cloudflare 1.1.1.1, which simply claims that, yeah, we are not collecting anything which you sent to, so very trust is required. And also, we have VPN services. Here, for example, the very famous NordVPN, which you all know from several advertisements on, for example, YouTube. And they claim that they are a so-called no-log VPN, so that they don't collect your traffic either. The way-to-go tool for privacy is Tor when browsing the internet. However, it is not really used by normal people on a daily basis, mainly due to its bad speed. In the context of Apple and privacy, they are currently strongly emphasizing it in all their devices and services, especially regarding privacy. For example, they introduced their app tracking transparency, which was very famous in media. They also have a bug bounty program called the Apple Security Bounty. However, if you read it like very little there, it also pays you for privacy vulnerabilities. So privacy is that important for them that they even pay you money if you find some vulnerabilities inside of it. With that strong privacy focus of Apple in mind, they invented their iCloud Private Relay. It is included with all iCloud Plus subscriptions, which already start at 99 cents here in Europe. And it is available on macOS, iOS and iPadOS, where it is already pre-installed, so you don't have to install any additional software. So the entry barriers to use the service are very low. About their service, Apple says that it prevents websites and network providers from creating a detailed profile about you, while the browsing experience still remains fast. So the privacy benefits, but you don't really know it because you can still browse like normal. The offered privacy is even so good that carriers started blocking their service. So for example here, T-Mobile blocked Private Relay because they don't get any vital network data and metadata anymore because the offered privacy of Private Relay is that good. So why do we need Private Relay and not just use a normal VPN or Tor? About that, Apple makes several claims in two sources. So first in a white paper which they published, and second in multiple talks at WWDC, which is their yearly developer conference. So regarding privacy, they claim that their approach has privacy built in by design, so privacy built in by design, and that users must not trust Apple in order to use their service because their service is so privacy friendly. And also regarding security, that only valid Apple devices and accounts are allowed to use their service. So no Linux device or something like that. Now, first, let's talk about the coarse architecture, which is described in these two sources. So first, for DNS queries, Private Relay deploys oblivious DNS over HTTPS, which is simply DNS over HTTPS, but with an additional proxy, or here relay, between the client and the resolver. So the relay knows the IP address of the client, so who's making the request, but due to the established HTTPS encryption, he doesn't know the DNS query's content. And also the resolver knows the content, but not who's making the request, because he only sees the IP of the relay between them. In the case of Private Relay, the relay between them is operated by Apple, and the resolver is operated by one of their partners, which is Akamai, Cloudflare, or Fastly. And under the assumption that the two parties are not colluding, we successfully separated the IP from the DNS query's content. Regarding network traffic, the idea is pretty similar to oblivious DNS over HTTPS, as traffic is proxied through their self-proclaimed innovative dual-hop architecture. So how does that work? So first, the client connects to the first relay, called the ingress relay, which is again operated by Apple. And over that established connection to the second relay, called the egress relay, which is again operated by one of their partners. And now we have the following case, that the first relay only knows the IP address of the client, but not the destination web server. And the second relay don't knows the client's IP address, but the destination of the web server. And again, under the assumption that the two relays are not colluding, we again separated the IP address from the destination web server. As Private Relay is a paid service, there must be, of course, any kind of access control deployed. But when considering the dual-hop architecture, users must authorize, especially to the egress, so the second relay, without revealing their identity, as that would break the previously mentioned separation of who's making the request and where it is going to. Apple introduced privacy tokens for that case, which split the authentication and the authorization into two steps. So we have an additional party, the authentication server. So first, the client sends his credentials to the authentication server, and they perform the RSA blind signature protocol together, which is just a protocol to generate private authorization tokens without the server learning the content of the token. And then the token is simply presented to the relays to authorize itself. Knowing the architecture, we can now define threats and their impact. So we start with their security claim. So Apple mentions that all connections through their servers are validated at the account and the device level. So that means that users connecting have an iCloud account and an active iCloud Plus subscription. And also that the connection is originating from a genuine Apple device. So why is it interesting to look into that claim? These IP addresses are often used as anti-abuse measures by several websites, and Apple even proactively publishes all IP addresses which they use. So it is simply available as a CSV file, and you can see like all addresses used by the service. So the problem now is that people started to whitelisting all of these IP addresses directly into their firewall. So for example here, we have an entry of the developer forum of Apple where somebody is asking, how can I whitelist these IP addresses on my web server? So they put that much trust into Apple's validation process that they say any connection from one of these IP addresses is assumed to be genuine, as this validation is fine. From that IP addresses, you can make requests without any firewall restrictions if somebody whitelisted them. And second, regarding their privacy claim, we have two threats. So first, if the assumption is broken that the two relays are not colluding, you can perform traffic correlation, and the architecture itself is now similar to like a normal VPN, and we don't have these privacy guarantees anymore. And the second threat, if you expose your identity to the second relay, which should only know the destination of your request. Now we can start into the reverse engineering process with that theory in mind, and we can look how it really works. So I did some videos for that, and I will take you into the process of discovering how stuff works. And yeah. So how do we start? First, we have to find the location where we can interact with the private relay. So for that, we open up the system settings, and it's very hidden here in the profile under iCloud. Then we have to scroll down, and here we see private relay. And here we have this window with a lot of text, which is a little boring, so you don't have to read it. We have a simple done button, which just closes the model, so also pretty boring. And we have a small button at the top to enable private relay. So we can just press the button, and we see that the relay is now enabled due to that private relay on. We also have now two options, two radio buttons available, where we can influence the selection of the IP address, which web servers then see, but that's not interesting for us. And of course, now at the top, we can disable private relay again. So now, to ensure that the private relay is enabled, we can just open up Safari and visit a website which gives information about the IP address from which we are visiting the website. So here we see that the ISP is Akamai Technologies. So the second relay in that case is operated by Akamai. We see that the organization is set to iCloud Private Relay, and we also have an IP address which is part of this CSV file. So now we have like an interaction possibility with the private relay implementation in the operating system. So now for the reversing setup, I started with FRIDA, which is a dynamic instrumentation toolkit in fancy words, and simply said, it just lets you to inject JS code into a running native process. That's very cool because we can then hook into a running process and look into class instances, variables, and other stuff during the runtime, so with real values. Directly built on top on FRIDA is XPC Spy, which allows us to intercept communication between different processes, and we can view the XPC messages, which is the inter-process communication in the Apple Cosmos. So for that, we fire up a terminal first, and we search for the process ID of the settings. So the settings is called Apple ID settings, and here we see the first entry with the process ID 3271. That's the settings process. So with that, we can fire up XPC Spy with an -R flag, which is just there for parsing Apple's proprietary BP list format, so don't mind about it, and also the process ID. Now we have to be a little bit fast because there's a lot of communication going on between the system settings and other processes. So now we open up the terminal, we go right before the enabling step, then we launch XPC Spy and wait for it until it is attached. So now we see here hook enabled, and we stop the script, and here we have like all communication of the settings with other processes. And here we look around to find interesting stuff. So there's a lot of uninteresting stuff, so UI stuff and stuff like that. But here we have a pretty interesting XPC call. So there we are communicating with a process called COM-Apple Network Service Proxy, and we send there a dictionary containing NSP server comments with the value 20. So what's sent is not that interesting for us, but we have like another process in which we can hook into. So now we again try to find a process which has this network service proxy inside of it. So we grab from the processes everything called network service proxy, and here we discover a file located in user libexec and network service proxy. So we simply copy that file into our current directory, and we perform the file comment on it to see what it is. And here we see it is a macOS universal binary, which is an executable for macOS. And here we have two flavors, and we are choosing the ARM version as I'm on an ARM MacBook. So to look in that binary, we use another tool, Ghidra. Ghidra is a software reverse engineering framework, again in fancy words, and simply said, it allows us to analyze binaries or compiled code. So we can throw that binary into Ghidra, and we can look into the code. So here we have the raw ARM code, which is pretty hard to read, but Ghidra also provides some abstraction for that. So here we see the 5 classes located inside that binary, and we can look into them. However, like with these whole implementation details in mind, that's a bit less for all that functionality. So there must be any other location where stuff is located. So we look into the imports, so what is mounted into that executable, and we find a lot of frameworks. And especially interesting here is the network service proxy framework. So if we have a binary and a library with the same name, it is likely that they are connected in some way. So we look into that. However, there are some problems because the framework is part of the private frameworks folder, which is only intended to be used by Apple's own apps. So if you, for example, write your own iPhone app and you include functionality of one of these frameworks, the app is straight up rejected if you submit them to the App Store. Because of that, it is closed source, and of course there is no documentation. And further, the framework is not directly stored on the disk, so we need to extract it from the DYLD cache, which is some large cache file which contains all frameworks, which are then dynamically mounted during the runtime. Having that done, we can again throw that framework in Ghidra again, and here we can look into the functions. And we see here the same prefix as we saw earlier, like these NSP. And we can look into it, and we see a lot of classes. And here we choose the NSP configuration class, just for an example. And here we see all functions of that class, so it's full functionality. Yeah. So now, as we have already opened it, we can look into the configuration, which is part of this NSP configuration class. Because it fully controls the behavior of private relay, which we see now. And it also contains a very privacy-critical part, so we are going to explore it together. So first, again, we use a Frider tool, now Frider Trace, on the NSP configuration class with a star. So it catches all function calls to that class object. So now, we are tracing 101 functions, all of that NSP configuration class. And we can open the system settings and enable private relay. And here we see all functions which are called of that class. And here, interesting, is the proxy configuration function, as it's called like very much, and it very much sounds like a getter for a proxy configuration, obviously. So we use Frider Trace again, but now for the proxy configuration function only to see its arguments and the stuff which is then returned. So we fire that up again, and we open the system settings, and we enable private relay, and we see a lot of stuff going on. So, for example, here, directly down at the bottom, we see the two DNS, Oblivious DNS over HTTPS resolvers, which are currently available for private relay. So, on the top, we have one of Cloudflare, and on the bottom, we have one of Akamai, which is this akasecure.net domain. Now, we can scroll up a bit, and you see there's a lot of items, and they are part of a list called proxies, and this list contains all available proxies which the private relay client can then use. So here we see first the type, which is called proxy hop, which defines if the relay is an ingress relay or an egress relay. Then we see some other not that interesting stuff. We have the proxy URL, which is the URL that the client is then connecting to. We have a version, and then some more not interesting stuff. And at the end, we have the vendor, so the partner which is providing the service. So in that case, that is a server provided by Akamai. Now, we can scroll up again. And here, we see a lot of entries. Which defines like the possible combinations, so the possible path where the relays can be combined. So for example, the first entry is over the relay with the index 0 from the proxies list, which we saw, and the second one, and that path has a probability of 30% of being chosen, and also we see it there down there with a probability of 65% and so on. So where is this information coming from? The client performs an HTTP request to an API server, which is owned by Apple upon multiple triggers. These triggers are called reasons in the implementation, and there are several. So for example, if a relay which you are currently connecting to experiences an outage, the configuration is fetched again. If you press this enable button or disable button inside the settings, you fetch a new configuration. And also, it is fetched periodically, so without required user interaction, like, for example, every 8 hours. So if we want to look into that request, we fire up Wireshark, which allows us to record and analyze network traffic. And again, we open up the settings, and we enable it. And we disable it, so the configuration should be fetched. But as you see, there is no request. That's because Apple deploys certificate pinning, which is a technique to prevent sniffing of encrypted network traffic. So exactly what we want to do. So I use a FRIDA script by Andy Davis, which allows us to extract these traffic secrets and import them into Wireshark so that we can see the requests which are being made. So we do that, and here we see a lot of HTTP2 requests being made to the IP of the Apple API server. So we see that request here, and we scroll a bit right there. We see a lot of HTTP2 stuff going on, so this magic header, the window update, and the settings, which is not interesting. And here, the headers request, which contains the request itself, which is performed to the client. So we also have a lot of headers. So to sum up, the configuration fetch request is just a plain HTTP GET request to that domain, and we have multiple headers being included in that request by the client. So, for example, we have the xmask client info header, which contains information about the device and the operation system from which the request is being made from. We have the reason, so why the configuration fetch request is performed. And especially interesting, we have a header called xmask subscription token, which starts with an EY. And EY is likely to be a JSON Web Token, so a JWT token. And they are just simply decodable. So we can throw that header on the left simply in a tool to decode it. And we get the payload which is contained inside these JWTs. So let's zoom in into the contents. And here we have two interesting attributes. So first we have an attribute called account ID, which could be a unique account identifier. And also we have a device ID, which could be a unique device identifier. So first, let's look into this device ID. The device ID can simply be found in the system settings under the name provisioning UDID. In the iPhone wiki, which is an unofficial Apple wiki, you find that this UDID is called a unique device identifier, which uniquely identifies each SoC manufactured by Apple. So yes, obviously, the device ID is a unique device identifier. Now to the account ID, it gets a bit more tricky because you cannot find it anywhere in the system settings directly. So I started Googling like every possible combinations of Apple, iCloud, account ID, and stuff like that. And I was successful, even if it's pretty stupid to just Google these words straight away, because I found this tweet by Misk, where they talk about an identifier called DSID, or Directory Service Identifier, which they found in the Apple Analytics service. So let's look into that tweet, and here we see the DSID, so that number looks pretty similar to our account ID. They both start in the same number range and are pretty similar. In that tweet, again, they claim that this ID, now in that screenshot, it's called DS Personal ID, is directly linked with all your data Apple has about you. So like your full name, your email address, and everything. And to verify that our account ID is really directly linked with all my account data, I used a very powerful tool we have here in Europe or in Germany, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, because we can simply request a data copy from Apple containing all the data which they have about me. So I did that, and I got especially the Apple account ID and device information stuff is interesting. And I got this table back, and here you see on the left, now it's called Apple ID number, which is the account ID, and directly linked to my Apple ID, my first name, my fake last name, my phone number, my address which I entered, and everything. So yeah, of course, the account ID is definitely a unique account identifier and linked with all of my data which Apple has about me. So now, with that in mind, let's remember back the dual hop architecture which Private Relay deploys. So what do we know? So first, as you saw, the configuration fully determines all available relays and also the combinations. It is fetched before every activation and even periodically without user interaction. It is intransparent to users, so you cannot see to which relays you are connecting to. And also interesting, the account and the device ID. So here I have an additional entity, the API configuration server. And what the header does is that you send your account and device ID to that server. So you tell them indirectly who you are, from what device you are connecting from, and like everything. And now, as Apple claimed that their service provides privacy by design, we can now assume that they want to abuse that personal information because they say, oh, now I want to target that specific user on that specific device to de-anonymize his traffic. So they can decide to serve you not a genuine configuration, but a configuration which only contains exactly 2 relays, which are both operated by Apple. So now the architecture looks like that, and we have 2 Apple relays. That breaks the assumption that the 2 relays are not colluding, and now we have the same setup as we would use like a normal VPN. So no privacy guarantees anymore. Regarding these 2 claims which they make, we can correct it to that their approach has some privacy built in by design. So it's a bit above a VPN, but not like comparable to the privacy offered by, for example, Tor. And especially that users must trust Apple that they don't abuse your personal data to serve you such a malicious configuration. How to fix that problem? The first and very easy fix would be to just remove the header, which contains these account ID and device ID, because I wrote a small Python script which also fetches the configuration, and it doesn't even check this header. So you can just let it out, and it also works fine. So that's very easy. However, the Corsa problem still persists, as you are making again an HTTP connection to fetch the configuration, and you again expose your IP address, and Apple could abuse that as well. That is not that critical as sending like your full account data and device information to them. So it's less critical, but it's still like a greater problem of their architecture with their configuration approach. Now we come to their security claim, where they said that only Apple devices can connect to private relay. And I found it, at least, let's say, interesting that they want to limit network protocol to a certain device. So to bypass that restriction, I wrote a known implementation of their client to make a connection to that relays. So first, what do we need to connect to a private relay? So first, we need these privacy tokens, which are used for authorization. Here we are handling the authentication part as a black box, so we only get these privacy tokens and fine. And of course, we need to implement the protocol which private relay deploys, which is here the mask protocol, which is proxying over HTTP. What is a privacy token? A privacy token is just raw bytes and consists of 4 parts. So first we have a leading 1. Then we have the ID of the public key, which is used to generate this token by the server. We have a random token, which is generated on the device. And we have the signature of the token, which is blindly made by the authentication server. The request, or the RSI blind signature protocol itself, is pretty similar to the request of the configuration fetch. However, that time it is a post request, so not just a get request. And we send there a list of several tokens, so these tokens from the slide earlier, and some additional authentication data to prove that you have an iCloud account and that you are an Apple device. And the authentication server responds with these signatures, which you can put together with the tokens to build a privacy token. The client automatically fetches these privacy tokens periodically, and if they are like low in number. So I wrote a small Python script which just extracts them, because they are likely not spent all in a single session. So the client stores them on the device to use them later to prevent an additional request. So this token extraction script simply reads these stored tokens from the device. So in that case, we extract the tokens from Akamai and write them to our current directory. And here we see we have 50 tokens for Akamai, which we can then use for authorization to the relays. They also have an expire date, and that is also checked. So you cannot store them forever and use them like in 5 years to authorize yourself. So the tokens need to be some kind of fresh. The client implementation itself is over the mask protocol. It is pretty new and currently standardized by the IETF. And on the right, you can see the protocol stack. So as you can see, it is built upon QUIC and TLS, and with an HTTP 3 implementation on the top, where also the mask implementation proxy lives. So if you wonder, why would you proxy traffic, especially network traffic, over HTTP, which is normally a protocol like to fetch websites and to get the response back? There are several benefits. So first, the very obvious, it has this TLS encryption inside of it. So it's HTTPS, which is pretty common and assumed to be secure. And also we can bypass firewalls with that who block, for example, IPsec traffic. As HTTPS runs on port 443, UDP or TCP, which is likely not to be blocked in a network because then nobody could make network requests. We need to make some adjustments to part of that implementation. So for example, here in the TLS layer, because the white paper mentions that the TLS handshake does not use a certificate for authentication, but raw public keys. So normally in the TLS handshake, the client sends the client hello message to the web server, and the web server responds with several messages and again with its certificate. And the raw public key only contains and the certificate contains a key, and the raw public keys is like only that key out of the certificate without the additional overhead information. So we need to adjust that in our TLS handshake to make it work. Then the mask implementation itself uses the connect and connect UDP method of HTTP, the connect method for TCP traffic, and the connect UDP traffic for UDP or quick traffic. So you can see here on the right the headers of the connect UDP request, where we have the method set to connect, the scheme HTTPS, and most importantly, the protocol is set to connect UDP to indicate that you use that protocol, and also in the path you define the destination to which you want to proxy your traffic to. So the procedure to tunnel a request over a relay now works as follows. So first you establish a connection to a relay with a connect method, where you also present a privacy token to authorize yourself. And if everything works fine, the relay responds with a 200 OK status code, so the connection is assumed to be established. Then here in that case, we just simply tunnel an HTTP 1.1 request over the relay to that site which we saw earlier, which gives this information about the implementation, and we get the response back. So let's see that in action. Again, I wrote a Python script which can make that, and we can fire that up. And here we see that the whole that we get the response back. We get the 200 status code back from the web request. And here we see the information about the IP address. And here again, we see the ISP is set to Akamai Technologies. The organization is iCloud Private Relay. And again, in the query, we see that the IP address from which we are making the request from is also contained on that CSV file. So regarding Apple's security claim, we can correct that it's not correct, because obviously that client can run on a Linux device, on a Windows device, or in whatever, where Python can run and you have an internet connection. So that's wrong, with the only limitation that you need an Apple device as a donator for these privacy tokens, which you can then use in the authorization. Why this claim does not hold has a large impact, as you saw earlier, due to that whitelisting, because now it is very easy to generate like spam bots, for example, if the IP addresses are whitelisted, and you can make arbitrary amount of requests with like a simple proxy client. All right. Now a quick conclusion. So reverse engineering is fun. Privacy by design is hard, especially as you saw that the architecture itself, with the separation into the two relays, is assumed to be privacy friendly. However, that simply choice of configuration like fully destroys the whole architecture. And last but not least, that limiting access to a certain device type in a network protocol is at least, let's say, difficult, as one could simply re-implement the protocol for himself and just make the requests. All right, so thank you for your attention, and feel free to ask me questions. And I would like to especially thank Jiska and Matthias, which supervised me during my thesis and that work a lot. So yeah, thank you.
Unmute? Yeah. So we have some questions from the audience.
Hi. Yes, tying to devices is at least difficult.
Yeah.
Did you happen to see in when it's requesting those tokens whether it is checking enforcement of any remote attestation of the identity and integrity of the device that's making the request?
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff going on, which is also like pretty deep down into the operating system with keys which are generated upon the initial setup of the device. So there's some stuff going on, but I don't know like the very deep technical details of it.
So I noticed with the public key, the raw public key that they send, they don't have revocation information. Which would normally be sent along with certificate. So say that the keys of those servers would leak, you'd have no way as a user to establish that the public key actually hasn't been revoked. So have you looked into that as well?
So normally, like in the certificate, you rely on that public key infrastructure containing these trusted certificates which are stored on your device. And the approach of the configuration is now that like Apple holds all of these certificates for you and only serves you these certificates which they assumed to be genuine in that configuration to you. So it has like the same outcoming, but you you move like this point of trust from your device to the Apple one.
Any more questions? I don't see any hands. Then, well, there's one. Here, okay, right.
I assume Apple has some mechanism to fight against unwanted uses of this anonymization. Like, have they published on how they do it? Do they like collude between the two relays, or what's the?
They claim that they perform some asynchronous double spend prevention of these tokens, but in general we don't know, and they don't make any claims about it, and we can only see it as a black box, so we don't know.
But my question is like, if not like W usage limit.
I don't hear it.
I'm not only about like double usage and the usage limits, but about preventing people from using it for purposes that would be bad PR for them, basically. Is there something about that?
So if that would be possible, that would break the privacy claims of their architecture. So yeah, of course, that would be bad.
I would like to know if you ever contacted with the Apple, and did you get any feedback about this, like thank you or any bounty or anything?
Yeah, I reported it to their bug bounty program, and there's currently an open disclosure going on, but that was like 2 or 3 months ago, and still then nothing changed. So that's like still the state of the service.
We have a question on the very far left of the stage.
Your I need closer to the middle. In your Vortrag, you mentioned that the Apple Datenschleuder, you excluded the header. Why did you do that? And can you talk more about that? With your Python script, you excluded the head before putting everything into the Datenschleuder?
Yeah. So the request you are making to get the configuration contains this JVT, and it's also named like this authorization. So at first you could think that it's supposed to prevent people without such a token from accessing the configuration, but it's not checked. And because it has like this privacy critical impact, I suggested to just remove it from there, as it's not even checked on the server. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That we are on time exactly. Thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.